Now let's discuss the role of the game designer in the game design process. First and foremost, the game designer must understand fun. To that end, as a designer, you must be able to answer these questions. What makes a game fun? Why do players play? Why are games engaging? What draws us in? So what does a game designer do? Well, they imagine, they define, they describe, they transmit, they implement, and they listen. We're going to talk about each of these in some amount of detail, starting with imagine. So where do ideas come from? They come from messing around. They come from looking at one thing and seeing something different. They come from asking why and why not, from not being satisfied with yesterday's discovery. Ideas come from other ideas, not from a vacuum. The famous French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson once said, "There are no new ideas in the world, only different arrangements of things." So what are sources of good game ideas? Of course, you can get inspired by other media, from film, from television, from books. I mean, so many games out there were inspired by things like Star Wars, by books like The Lord of the Rings, and so forth. You can also get great game ideas from life experiences, going out in the world and traveling, experiencing new cultures, meeting people, talking to people, doing things like playing sports, having new experiences, that sort of thing. Of course, you can also be inspired by education, looking at history, looking at art, humanities, even engineering. All of those things can be great inspirations for game ideas. And of course, you can also be inspired by other games, and not just digital games. If your focus is creating digital games, you might get a lot of inspiration from playing a board game, for example. Ernest Adams, the game designer, also said, "Game ideas come from almost anywhere, but they don't just walk up and introduce themselves. Creativity is an active, not a passive process." And of course, game designers also need to define these ideas. So what do they actually need to define? They need to define all the elements that make up the game. This is the design play experience framework that I came up. We'll be using this throughout this course. It decomposes the elements that make up a game. The framework defines the role of the designer on one side and the player on the other. So the designer designs the game that the player will ultimately experience. But in the middle is this sort of magic place where the designer and the player meet. So that is the actual dynamic play experience of the game. So below that top layer of design play experience, you can see these different elements that the designer must actually design, such as the storytelling in the game, or the gameplay, or the user experience. And these three things rest on the bed of technology. So the technology defines the user experience or limits it or enables it, as well as the gameplay and the storytelling. And there's a design aspect where the designer will design, for example, a story into the game. Then there's the middle area where that story evolves for the player. One player might go left, another player goes right. That's where the storytelling actually happens. And then there's the actual experience element that the player actually walks away with. So that's the actual player story. When I play the game, I'm going to walk away with a different story than when you play the game, as an example. So each of these elements, storytelling, gameplay, user experience, has a design, play, and experience aspect. We'll talk about this in more detail later. So the next thing that we need to do as a game designer is we need to be able to describe our game. So how do we describe the elements that we just talked about that make up our game? It's very important to do this in a conceptual way. This means being clear, concise, accurate, unambiguous, and above all, understandable. Often this is done in verbal communication as well as written form. Yes, to be a good game designer, I really think you need to be a good writer. You also need to describe these elements in a very functional way. That is, you need to be very explicit. You need to cover all of the conditions. If you think of a game mechanic, how is that game mechanic going to function throughout the game when all the different conditions are in effect? And you also need to describe them in an artistic sense. So you need to be able to, communicate these things through perhaps illustrations, storyboards, artistic renderings, and so forth. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily need to be a great artist yourself, but you need to be able to, work with an artist, pass your ideas onto an artist so they can then, create those elements that help describe your game to a larger team. And that leads us to the next element. The designer needs to be able to transmit that design of the game that they're describing. This is often done during meetings or via design documentation. We'll discuss both of these elements, team meetings and design documentation in more detail as we continue through the course. Game designers then must assist in the implementation of the game. Game designers are not just the idea person. I repeat this, that the notion that a game designer just sits back and comes up with great ideas and then there's a team that implements those great ideas, that is a myth. The game designer is a very active member of the implementation team. Here are just some of the few things that they do. They hold that vision of the game, and the vision may not actually even come from them. It may come from somebody else. It may come from a mandate. They may be making a sequel to a game that already exists. So the vision may already exist. But they hold that vision, and they are the checker of that vision. So as the game is coming together, they make sure that the game is matching the vision that was set out for at the beginning. Game designers often are the best quality assurance people. They play test the game themselves, and of course they get play testers and observe those play tests and make sure, once again, that it's following that vision. Game designers often also need to prototype their ideas, so they need to be able to kind of get into a game engine. It might not be the actual engine that the end game is being made, but they need to be able to have a tool that they can use to prototype the ideas that they're coming up with to help communicate that to the larger team. This could be in the form of a physical prototype, we'll talk about that more later, or a digital prototype. Game designers often are the ones that are actually putting together the levels of the game, so working with programmers that are implementing the game mechanics or the gameplay, and working with artists that are creating all the art assets, and then the game designer is the one that assembles those to actually create the levels. Game designers also are often involved in the user interface design of a game. It's one of the roles that game designers often take. And sometimes game designers also maybe manage or lead the team. Particularly on a smaller team project, a game designer might be wearing multiple hats, and one of those hats might be team lead. Across all of these tasks, a game designer must be a good listener. Who do they listen to? Well, first and foremost, they need to listen to themselves. They need to, have sort of an inner sense of their design and kind of trust their gut as the game is evolving and as they are designing it, as they are seeing how it progresses. Of course, they also need to listen to their players, that target audience that we talked about, the play testers. So they need to listen to the feedback that they're getting, and maybe the design isn't accomplishing what they think it would accomplish. Back to that design play experience framework that we talked about. If the experience that the players are actually having is not the experience that the designer thinks they should be having, then they need to go back and modify that design. Of course, they also need to listen to their team. Your team is one of the most important aspects. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the team is also sharing in the design. So being a game designer doesn't just mean that, once again, that you're coming up with all the ideas. You're listening to your team, because a lot of times a programmer may have the best idea, or an artist may have the best idea that can funnel into the overall design of the game. And the game designer also needs to listen to the industry. What are the trends? What is popular? What is emerging? What is fading? They need to understand the world out there. How is the world changing? What is the world, opening up to, and that sort of thing. These are all important things that the game designer needs to be able to listen to.